Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the recent surge of high attack units in Age of Empires 2 that has been taking place for a few years now, but has gotten more extreme in the past few years. Now keep in mind, just because we're seeing a surge of high attack units, this does not mean that it's inherently a bad thing. It's just something I've noticed, and it's a really interesting topic for discussion. If you take a look back to the original game after the Conqueror's expansion, which was the first original expansion to the Age of Kings base game, we can see that the units didn't have that high of an attack. In fact, every time a unit had a really high attack, it was traded off with an extremely big downside, or it's just a heavy price, so you have to pay a big price for a big attack. Let's take a look at some of these options, like for example the Paladin that went up to 18 attack, 14 plus 4. This was considered probably the best unit in the Conqueror's expansion and a really strong, well-rounded 18 attack unit, but it's of course very expensive to upgrade and very expensive base price associated to it. Then you also had the Elite War Elephant that capped out at 24, and you also have the Elite Teutonic Knight that capped out at 21. Both of these units are extremely slow, quite costly, and have inherent very big downsides. Then we also have the Champion line, which caps out at 17 attack, which is pretty solid but nothing too crazy, and of course it has its natural downsides, taking a long time to tech into and being rather slow and an infantry unit. Now clearly the original game designers had this idea that attack is a very important stat on a melee unit, because how much attack it does pretty much dictates what kind of fights it can take, how well it performs in melee combat, and how much it can snowball small number advantages. They also had in mind that units hitting buildings was going to be a really big part of the game, and so lowering the attack on some of these really strong units was pretty much mandatory, since killing buildings with units could become a really big threat, and so they didn't want to go too crazy with the numbers, or at least I can assume so. However, since then we've got a ton of expansions that have noticed a pattern that gave a lot more attack to units, and we've broke that barrier of 18 for the Paladin being a really high number. Nowadays 18 for Paladin is just where we're getting started. Let's take a look at a few units nowadays that go well above the 18 threshold without having that inherent downside that the Teutonic Knight and the Elite War Elephant had. For starters, and this is a very light case that came in early on, we had the Malion Farimba. Now Farimba gave +5 attack to cavalry units, and because of its flexibility, the developers decided to take away Blast Furnace from the Malions. This was a really smart choice, as it let the Malions shine in a lot of cavalry situations without making them overpowered. For example, they have 12 plus 7 Cavalier for a total of 19 damage, more than the average Paladin. However, the downside is they don't have the perks of the Paladin, like the plus 40 HP and the extra Pierce Armor. Of course, this does get more nuanced the more we look at it, but of course Farimba is much cheaper than the Paladin upgrade, and sometimes the extra attack comes in handy, and of course Farimba applies to camels and light cavalry, so it's an amazing upgrade, there's no doubt about it. It's a great upgrade, but it's simply not overpowered, and it's a very nice power level for the Malions. However, the high attacks gets even crazier from then onwards. Next example is the Litus. Now the Litus comes out of the castle currently with 13 attack. It has received some changes in recent 2-3 years, so this might not be the number you're familiar with at the start of Definitive Edition, but it has 13 base attack in castle, which is already pretty high comparing it to the base attack of the knight at just 10. Also keep in mind that the Litus does not have any inherent downsides. It's not too pricey in gold, only costing you 50 apiece compared to the knight, which costs 75, and it's not very slow compared to the Teutonic Knight or the War Elephant. So the 13 attack coming in is really solid as a base value. However, the problem is when it gets up to the relic count that Lithuanians can get, which is a total of 4, then you can get the Litus up at 13 plus 4 from the relics plus another 2 from the blacksmith upgrades, making a total of a 19 attack unit in Castle Age. You can see how this progression of high attack has made its way from 18 being the peak at Imperial Age for cavalry units to now being 19 in Castle Age. All you need to do is get relics and upgrades. Well, I say all you need to do, but it is a very big task to get 4 relics, so it's not exactly broken. It's not like the Litus will auto win you the game, but it is going to be putting out a ton of damage. However, the thing that you have to consider with the Litus as well is that it ignores armor. So not only is it doing 19 damage, it is in fact doing 19 damage every hit because it ignores melee armor. This is insane and way better and way stronger in melee combat than even the Paladin of the back in the day situation, back in the day generic civilizations. Now, of course, the downside to this is that the Litus lacks a pierce armor. It only has 1, and so it's not going to be as deadly against archer units, and so clearly the attack and the armor piercing capabilities are its strong point. It also is noted that the Elite Litus goes up to 22 attack and imp, which is 4 more than the Paladin of the Conqueror's edition. Moving on to the next example, we've got the Manasa. Now the Manasa in Castle Age starts with a base attack of 12, which already is quite strong, but then it can go up to 12 plus 6. And contrary to the Lithuanians, you don't need to pick up any relics for this one to get its buff. You just need to make more of it. It gets buffed for every 5 extra units you have of it, either Manasa or Knights. So let's say we're only going Manasa. If you have 6 Manasa, you get the +1 buff. If you add 5 more to that number, you get another +1 attack, capping out at 21 Manasa, giving you the full +4 from that effect. So if we gather the +4 effect from the Manasas being masked, plus the 2 upgrades in Castle Age, we get 12 plus 6, 18 damage in the Castle Age from this unit, which scales to Elite Manasa having 14 plus 8 in Imp, because Georgians actually do not lose the Blast Furnace like Lithuanians did. And so now we have 14 plus 8 for a total of 22 damage for the Manasas in Imperial Age. Still less than the lightest, since of course they're both at 22, but the lightest ignores armor. However, it is still an insanely high attack damage. Of course, the downside to the Manasa is that it has low HP, and although it has high melee armor, its pierce armor is quite regular, not giving it too much strength in ranged combat, and so you have to close the gap to get the benefit from the damage. Still an insane unit and a ton of damage output. Next, we also have to talk about some charge mechanic that has been recently added into the game, which also adds another surge of more attack into these melee units. The Centurion has 13 base attack in Castle Age, going up to 15, 13 plus 2 armor upgrades. Then in Imperial Age, it becomes a 15 plus 4 unit, and it can even go up to +9 if you consider the charge damage, which the charge only impacts for the first hit, then it has to recharge for about 30 seconds, and then you get the value again of +5. So 15 plus 4, the Centurion will do 19 damage base for the Romans, and then if you add the charge onto that, it can deal 19 plus 5, so 24 damage on its first hits. This is quite absurd, and we're getting to some really high numbers here, and especially the fact that the unit itself starts out really strong in Castle Age. If you can get it massed into the Imperial Age with all the upgrades, it can deal a ton of damage with that charge, and then even without the charge, it still dishes out a really high number of 19 damage. And where the charge really gets crazy is the Custodier. The Custodier in Castle Age has 8 plus 22, 20 damage from the charge built in, no need for an upgrade, and then 2 from the blacksmith upgrades in Castle Age, so you're hitting for 30 damage with a fully upgraded Castle Age Custodier, which is absolutely absurd. And of course, it is a charge damage, so it naturally has its downside. You don't hit for this amount every time. The Custodier will hit 30 on its first hit, and then it has a rather weak base attack of only 8, plus 2 from the blacksmith, so only 10, comparable to the knights. So as you can see, the developers have given more attack to these units, but they always kept it as somewhat of a downside or somewhat of a drawback to the unit comparable to the generic option. The Custodier in Imp has 11 plus 29 after full upgrades, 25 from the charge attack, and plus 4 from blacksmith upgrades, making for the 40 attack charge damage Elite Custodier, which is the highest attack on a cavalry unit that you can find in Age of Empires 2. Of course, it is a charge attack, so it will reset after the first hit to 11 plus 4, which is 15. Still a decent output, but not close or comparable to the Paladin. So you get a high attack initially, and then it drops off as the fight goes on. It is also worth mentioning that they boosted the attack of a lot of infantry units, and not just cavalry units, such as the Samurai, Berserk, and the Jaguar Warrior. Especially in the Castle Age, they gave a +2 or even +3 attack bonus to these units, as they were just simply way too weak in prior versions of the game, especially in the Conquerors, which kind of left infantry with no real strong stats to fend off of themselves, and a lot of infantry unique units felt underwhelming. And so those buffs came really good for those infantry units that can now hold their own in Castle Age and scale nicely into the Imperial Age. It is worth mentioning that you have Dravidians with Wood Steel that gets a lot of attack that ignores armor as well, but I think the examples I chose were actually more fitting for this video, as the numbers were much higher. Now that we've noticed a pattern emerge and we've seen how the attack has really increased over the years, let's talk about a few implications this has, and let's question whether the original developers overrated the attack stats or whether we're overdoing it nowadays with how high the attack has gone. Now, if you consider how the game was played a while ago in the Age of Conquerors, now a while ago, like 20 years ago in the Age of Conquerors expansion, there was usually a lot of lag just because the equipment and the connections weren't great, and in general, players were not the most competent with micro. I don't say this as a slight to them or any backhanded comment, I just mean that the game was still fresh and people weren't doing the crazy micro moves we see these days, and so melee units were actually just fighting and patrolling more often than not. You don't see the crazy micro of cabbages hitting and running. Most of the time people had army and they just fought with it, and let's just see who wins. And so if you gave really high attack back in the day, the melee units would simply be overpowered. They would run all the way up against the range units and they'd shred them in just a couple of hits, and the range unit player couldn't really defend himself due to not knowing how to micro correctly 100%, and due to the lag just being so high that you can't get out of the way every single time against against the charge of the cavalry units. This is why the developers had to keep a close eye on that attack and not make it so that the melee units can overrun any archer units and can even break buildings very quickly with high attack. And so I personally believe that although the attack stat was very kept in check back in the day, I think it was for good reason, and I think they were right to do so. However, as the game developed, as the equipment developed, the attack stat these days is just simply not the most important thing when looking at a melee unit. In fact, the most important thing is usually the pierce armor, as it lets you run in under high pressure situation when your opponent has a bunch of castles, town centers, and army, and you're able to tank that damage, get up there, and start attacking. If you die before you join the combat against excellent micro or against a well-positioned base, your cavalry units, even with all the attack in the world, can't really do anything because it doesn't get a chance to hit. And so as we got better as players, and as the equipment got better, and as players got smarter with their strategies, they were able to avoid fights against melee units, and melee units fighting big battles just became a hard thing to pull off in general. This is potentially why the developers buffed a lot of these units and gave them crazy attack stats so that you can actually get rewarded if you do close the gap and get up close. And we have these glass cannon units that do a lot of damage up close in combat, but just have other weaknesses that prevent them from always being able to fight. One other factor that really led to the attack stat getting out of hand is the fact that we realized that units coming out of a castle are simply at a massive disadvantage. Having to mine 650 stone, make a castle, and then start producing units usually left you dying to just someone spamming knights from 2 stables, or spamming crossbows or cavalry archers. And so the unit that comes out of the castle has to be much stronger than the generic options, or else it's simply never worth going for it. Think of it, why would you go for a 10 attack infantry unique unit when you can just go for a longsword that has 9 attack? This is the exact dilemma that led to a lot of the infantry unique units like the berserk getting an attack buff in castle age. Same thing for the lightest and the boyar getting an attack buff in castle age to set them apart from their counterpart, the knight that comes out of the stable. In my opinion, this was a really good change from the developers, and I give them a lot of credit for coming up with a solution to give castle units that flair, that thing to set them apart from the generic counterpart, and to also keep them unique and not overpowered while doing so. Every unit that gets really high attack in this list has some inherent downside and has some counterplay to it. Of course, there are some units, especially the Manasa, that's a little bit overtuned, but I would argue it's more about how easy it is to mass them and their cheap cost, and rather than their high attack. Overall, I think the increase of attack on melee units allowed us to get more flavor to our game. It let unique units shine in various diverse situations. Both melee units on foot, so infantry, and cavalry units, especially from the castle, felt a little generic and felt a little bit underrepresented before a lot of these changes came in. And so I want to give a lot of credit to developers for noticing this issue and finding a good solution to it. Going forward though, I do question whether the high attack units could become a problem, whether the game will become too snowbally because we just have units that are way too strong, and so if they get to the favorable position and they're able to take out your army while you're not looking, it could just be way too one-sided of a fight and they can start snowballing games way too quickly. It is a very interesting discussion, and I'd like to know your thoughts on it. Have we gone too crazy with the high attack units? Is there still room to experiment, or are we just at the right position where this should be like the highest we go and we can start thinking of other unique aspects to give unique units instead of simply more attack? I also want to know your thoughts on the charge mechanic and whether that's good for the game, whether that feels healthy or not, and let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe if you did enjoy, and feel free to check out my other links in the description: Twitch for live streams and Patreon for guides and build orders. Take care, like, comment, subscribe. See you guys next time. Peace.